The shadow that lurked in the night. My name is Michael Carter. In December of 1995, I was a college student trying to make ends meet while pursuing a degree in media studies. To help cover my expenses, I worked as a part-time vlogger, capturing the essence of urban life and sharing it on my modest YouTube channel. Back then, I had no idea that a single night would shatter my perception of reality and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew. It all began on the cold night of December 15th, 1995. I lived alone in a cramped studio apartment in an older part of Chicago. The rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was relatively quiet, but it had an unsettling vibe that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The apartment was the perfect size for one person, but the creaky floorboards and the drafty windows often made me feel like I wasn't truly alone. That evening, I attended a Christmas party hosted by one of my classmates, Rachel. The party was lively, filled with holiday cheer, and I spent a good portion of it chatting with friends and enjoying the festive atmosphere. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The snow had started falling heavily, and the streets were blanketed in white by the time I left. As always, I brought my trusty video camera with me. Filming my surroundings had become second nature. I loved capturing the beauty of the city at night, the interplay of light and shadow, and the quiet moments most people missed. That night was no exception. I mounted my camera on my bike's handlebar and began pedaling home, the snow crunching beneath my tires. The streets were eerily deserted. The only sounds were the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional gust of wind. I decided to take a detour past St. Vincent's Hospital, an old, partially abandoned building with a storied history. Its imposing facade and darkened windows gave it an almost supernatural presence, especially at night. As I approached the hospital, my camera began to act up. The autofocus started jittering, locking onto something ahead of me. First, I thought it was a glitch, but the camera kept refocusing as if it were trying to capture a face. A chill ran down my spine. I stopped and lifted the camera to my eye, scanning the area for anything unusual. But there was nothing, just empty streets and the snow-covered hospital looming in the distance. "It's just a glitch," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the growing unease. I resumed pedaling, but the camera continued its strange behavior. The autofocus would jitter, then snap into focus, as though it was tracking something invisible. I felt the cold seep into my bones, and it wasn't just from the weather. Something about that stretch of road felt wrong. By the time I reached my apartment, I was visibly shaken. I locked the door behind me and immediately reviewed the footage. As I scrubbed through the video, I noticed the autofocus glitching at the exact moments I had felt uneasy, slowing the footage down frame by frame. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, a shadow darted across the frame, vague, human-shaped, and impossibly fast. I slammed my laptop shut and sat frozen, my heart racing. "It's just a coincidence," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the heater, even my own breathing. At one point, I swore I heard faint footsteps outside my door, but when I checked, the hallway was empty. The following days were no better. I started hearing strange noises at odd hours, soft whispers, faint breathing, and a persistent tapping that seemed to come from the walls. My neighbor's dog, usually quiet, began barking incessantly every night around 3 a.m. The worst part, though, was the sensation of being watched. It was a constant, oppressive feeling that made my skin crawl. I began keeping the lights on at all hours, but it did little to ease my anxiety. 2 weeks later, I decided I needed to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with my camera and a flashlight, I returned to St. Vincent's Hospital at midnight. The streets were as empty as they had been that first night, and the cold air stung my face as I approached the hospital. The camera began to act up almost immediately. Its autofocus jittered before locking onto something in the shadows. I stopped and shone my flashlight in the direction the camera was focusing, but the beam revealed nothing. Swallowing my fear, I zoomed in with the camera. My hands trembled as I saw it. A dark, humanoid figure standing just at the edge of the light. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing, even from a distance. Panic surged through me. I turned to run but stumbled, dropping my flashlight in the process, scrambling to pick it up. My eyes caught something scrawled on the pavement near the hospital entrance. "Don't come back." I didn't need any further encouragement. I bolted, pedaling as fast as I could back to my apartment. The next few days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. I began seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye and hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I eventually decided to move out of the apartment and stay with a friend. The moment I stepped into my friend's home, the oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But the experience has stayed with me. Even now, years later, I sometimes feel its presence, a fleeting shadow, a soft whisper, a faint chill in the air. I never uploaded the footage from that night. Some things are better left unseen, better left untold. The Haunting of Willow Creek Manor. My name is Nathan Cole, and for the past decade, I've worked as a contractor specializing in home renovations. It's a profession I take pride in, but it comes with its ups and downs, especially during tough economic times. By the spring of 2003, work had dried up, and I was struggling to make ends meet. Then came a lifeline, a call from an old friend, Jake. He told me about a man named Mark Dawson, a recent homeowner who needed someone to fix up his property in Willow Creek, a quiet, sparsely populated suburb a couple of hours outside Milwaukee. "It's a big house," Jake said. "Needs a lot of work, but Mark's paying well. He's looking to flip it, desperate for a paycheck." I agreed without hesitation. The next morning, I drove out to Willow Creek. The town was smaller than I expected, with only a handful of stores and a gas station lining its main street. The house itself, perched at the edge of town on a hill surrounded by dense woods, was a looming Victorian structure with an air of neglect. Mark met me in the driveway. He was polite but distant, handing me the keys and a list of repairs before quickly leaving. "I've got to get back to the city," he said. "Call me if you need anything." As I stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The air was stale, and the wooden floorboards groaned under my boots. But I wasn't one to get spooked easily. To me, it was just another job. That first night went smoothly. I unloaded my tools, made a list of supplies, and set up a small cot in one of the upstairs bedrooms. With no TV or internet, I passed the time reading by the dim light of a single lamp. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, and the old house seemed to creak and groan with every gust. But I slept well, feeling optimistic about the days ahead. On the second night, things started to feel off. After a full day of unloading materials and prepping the kitchen for demolition, I climbed into bed, exhausted. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud bang from downstairs. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept down to the kitchen to investigate. My heart sank when I saw the heavy wooden cabinet I had secured earlier lying flat on the floor. It was solid oak and weighed a ton. No way it could have fallen on its own. Too tired to deal with it, I decided to leave it for the morning. But as I headed back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached my room, I froze. The door was ajar, and the light was on. I distinctly remembered turning it off before heading downstairs. Maybe I forgot. I mumbled to myself, trying to stay rational. But the unease lingered as I climbed into bed. The next morning, I got to work patching the cracked walls in the living room. Just as I began drilling into the plaster, my power drill suddenly sputtered and died. After an hour of troubleshooting, I realized the motor had burned out, a rare and frustrating occurrence. Frustrated but determined, I switched to using a hammer. But as I was driving nails into the frame of a doorway, the hammer's head snapped clean off, sending shards of metal flying. One of them grazed my hand, leaving a deep cut. "Damn it!" I hissed, wrapping my hand in a rag. In all my years of construction, I'd never had so much trouble with basic tools. By the time night fell, I was mentally and physically drained. That evening, I decided to take a hot shower to unwind. As I stepped into the bathroom, steam began to fog up the mirror. I reached for the soap but froze. There, in the corner of the mirror, was a faint handprint. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was a leftover smudge from the previous owner. I turned on the water and began washing my hair. When I reached for the shampoo, I stopped cold. My hair was already covered in suds, and I hadn't touched the bottle yet. Panic set in. I rinsed off as quickly as I could and bolted out of the bathroom, my heart hammering in my chest. Over the next week, the strange occurrences escalated. My tools would disappear, only to reappear in bizarre locations. Doors slammed on their own, and I often heard faint whispers coming from the empty rooms. One night, I woke to the sound of frantic knocking on my bedroom door, followed by footsteps racing down the hall. I burst out of bed, flashlight in hand, but found nothing except silence. By the third week, I was at my breaking point. My work had slowed to a crawl due to the constant disruptions, and my nerves were shot. The final straw came one morning when I discovered my tools scattered across the front yard, as if someone or something had thrown them out in a fit of rage. I called Mark that afternoon and told him I couldn't finish the job. He seemed disappointed but didn't press for details. A few weeks later, Jake mentioned that Mark had been unable to sell the house. "No one wants to live there," he said. "Apparently, the place has a history." I never asked for details. I didn't want to know. To this day, I avoid Willow Creek whenever I can. But on the rare occasions when I find myself driving past that house, I feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Some places are better left untouched. Willow Creek Manor is one of them. The Whispers in Ashfield. My name is Claire Bennett, and I live in a small, peaceful town called Ashfield in upstate New York. It's a picturesque place with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a strong sense of community. I moved here 3 years ago with my 2-year-old daughter, Emma. For privacy and safety, I'll use Emma's middle name throughout this story. We lived in a charming but modest house at the edge of town. It was built in the late 1800s, with creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and a slightly eerie character that added to its charm. I never imagined that this house, with its welcoming exterior, would become the stage for a series of unsettling events. Started about a month ago, I had begun noticing subtle changes in Emma's behavior, especially during her naps and at night. Normally, she was a playful and imaginative child, often chatting with her toys or inventing little games in her room. But one afternoon, I noticed she had gone unusually quiet. Curious, I peeked into her room and found her sitting on the floor, motionless. She was staring at her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Emma?" I asked softly, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" In her toddler-like speech, she responded, "Make go away." I frowned. "Make what go away?" She shook her hands frantically, as though trying to fling something off of them. Then she started screaming, "No, no," repeatedly, her small body trembling. I scooped her up, held her close, and whispered calming words until she stopped crying. But her reaction haunted me. I dismissed it as a bad dream or an overactive imagination. But deep down, something felt off. That night, I put her to bed as usual, kissed her forehead, and told her I loved her. She smiled sleepily, and I thought the worst was over. But a few hours later, I heard a scream from her room. Rushing in, I found her sitting upright in bed, staring at the wall across from her. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't move or make a sound. "Emma," I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I knelt in front of her, gently turning her head toward me, but her gaze remained fixed on the wall. Finally, I picked her up, cradling her against my chest. She buried her face into my shoulder, refusing to answer any of my questions. The next 2 days passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the house. No matter where I went, I felt as though someone was watching me. It was a heavy, oppressive feeling that made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was simply tired and overthinking. But that night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. After putting Emma to bed, I stayed up to tidy the kitchen. As I washed her plastic bowls and cups, I felt a sudden chill, as though a cold draft had swept through the room. Shaking it off, I finished cleaning and left the items to dry on the counter. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a loud thud from the kitchen. When I went to investigate, I found Emma's bowl and cup on the floor. I frowned, wondering if I had placed them too close to the edge of the counter. But when I checked, the counter was dry and clean. It didn't make sense for the items to have fallen on their own. Feeling uneasy, I washed them again, dried them thoroughly, and put them in the cabinet. I then checked on Emma and went to bed. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Hours passed. I watched the second hand of the clock tick its way around, counting each movement as though it would bring me some relief. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I felt the distinct pressure of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. My breath caught in my throat. The weight wasn't light. Like a child's, it was heavier, deliberate. I froze, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I felt it, a hand sliding into mine. Terrified, I rolled over quickly, expecting to see someone there, but the bed was empty. My hand, however, was cold, as though it had been held by something icy. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard a sharp, stern whisper, "Shoo!" It was close, right next to my ear. I bolted upright, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Moments later, I heard Emma crying from her room. I ran to her and found her in the same position as before, sitting upright in bed, staring at the wall with tears streaming down her face. "Emma, it's okay," I whispered, pulling her into my arms. She clung to me, trembling. "What did you see?" I asked gently. She didn't answer, only burying her face deeper into my shoulder. Over the next few days, I did everything I could to cleanse the house. I burned sage, opened the windows, and prayed, but the heavy feeling persisted, as did the strange events. I started researching night terrors and childhood phobias, hoping to find an explanation for Emma's behavior. But the more I read, the more questions I had. Was this really just a phase? Or was something more sinister at play? One question haunted me above all. Why would something target my child? I thought back to the day Emma stared at her hands, screaming for something to go away. Was she seeing something from a past life? Or was there a spirit clinging to her, tormenting her in ways I couldn't understand? I don't have the answers. To this day, the events in Ashfield remain a mystery. I eventually moved out of that house, seeking a fresh start for Emma and me. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, feeling that same heavy presence. And I can't help but wonder, did we truly leave it behind, or did it follow us? The Shadow of Belmont Street. My name is Lucy Anderson, and I've been sensitive to strange, unexplained phenomena for as long as I can remember. My earliest memories are dotted with eerie encounters, but the most vivid ones occurred when I was 9 years old. At the time, my family lived in a small, aging house on Belmont Street in the quiet town of Redwood Falls, Minnesota. Our neighborhood had an eerie charm. The roads were unpaved, just stretches of dirt winding through rows of old, modest homes. Our house was tiny, with creaky wooden floors and thin walls that barely kept out the cold during the harsh Midwestern winters. The most peculiar aspect of our neighborhood, however, was its proximity to two cemeteries. One of the cemeteries was well maintained, with neatly trimmed grass and polished headstones. It felt almost peaceful, like a park where people could stroll and reflect. The other cemetery, hidden behind a cluster of trees, was its complete opposite. Overgrown, forgotten, and hauntingly still. My younger sister, Emily, and I loved exploring the cemeteries, particularly the old one. While most kids played tag or built forts, we spent our afternoons wandering among the graves, reading the names and dates etched into the weathered stones. Sometimes, our mother turned it into a game, creating scavenger hunts for us. We'd search for specific names, dates, or even unique objects like a particular insect or a flower. I realize now how unusual it was, but at the time, felt like harmless fun. The old cemetery fascinated us, its crumbling gravestones and gnarled trees whispering secrets of the past. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a cool autumn evening, and my parents had allowed Emily and me to host a scavenger hunt in the old cemetery with a few neighborhood kids. Armed with flashlights and our mother's handwritten list, we scoured the grounds in pairs, searching for clues. I was partnered with my friend Molly, who was about my age. As we searched for a name etched into a headstone, I noticed a small clearing ahead, bathed in pale moonlight. Standing in the middle of the clearing was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long black coat that brushed the tops of his polished boots. A wide-brimmed hat obscured much of his face, but I could feel his eyes fixed on me. "Molly," I whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Do you see him?" She followed my gaze but frowned. "See who?" I pointed to the man. "Him, right there." Molly shook her head. "Lucy, there's no one there." I turned back to the clearing, but the man was gone. The moonlight still illuminated the spot where he had stood, but there was no trace of him. "Let's keep going," Molly said, clearly unnerved by my behavior. I nodded, but my mind was racing. Had I imagined him, or was he real? A few months later, another incident solidified my belief that something strange was happening around us. Emily and I shared a small bedroom, sleeping in a bunk bed that creaked whenever we moved. One night, I woke up suddenly, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside our window. I glanced toward the far wall, and my breath caught in my throat. There, crouched against the wall, was the same man I had seen in the cemetery. He wasn't wearing his long coat this time. Instead, he was dressed in what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, a loose shirt, suspenders, and trousers. His hat, however, was the same. He smiled at me, the strange, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, sheer terror took over. I flung the blanket off me and bolted for my parents' room. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed. "There's a man in our room." My father jumped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the door, and ran to check. Emily woke up, confused and groggy, as my mother tried to calm me down. When my dad returned, he looked puzzled. "There's no one there, Lucy," he said. "But I saw him," I insisted. "He was sitting right there." My dad checked the windows, which were sealed with thick plastic to keep out the cold. There was no sign of forced entry. "You must have had a nightmare," my mom said gently, pulling me into a hug. But it wasn't a nightmare. I knew what I had seen. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why did he appear to me and not to anyone else? I began researching hauntings and spirits, though the limited resources in our local library didn't provide many answers. One theory stuck with me. Spirits often linger in places where they experience strong emotions, such as love, anger, or fear. Had something happened to him in the cemetery? Or worse, in our house? As the months passed, strange things began happening around the house. Lights flickered for no reason. Doors creaked open on their own. On several occasions, my mother found objects, keys, books, and even Emily's favorite doll, moved from where she had left them. My father, ever the skeptic, blamed the drafty old house and our overactive imaginations. But my mother seemed less sure. I often caught her glancing over her shoulder or pausing in the middle of her chores, as if she'd heard something. One day, Emily told me she had seen the man too. "He was sitting on the stairs," she said matter-of-factly. "He smiled at me, but it wasn't a nice smile." I shivered, desperate for answers. I decided to investigate the history of our house and the cemetery. With the help of a neighbor, Mr. Turner, I learned that Belmont Street had once been part of a larger property owned by a wealthy family in the 1800s. The old cemetery was originally a private burial ground for their relatives and servants. One of the family's workers, a man named Jacob Thornton, had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said he had fallen into a well. Others whispered of foul play. Was Jacob the man I had seen? One stormy night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart pounding. The door creaked open, and there he was, Jacob, or whatever he had become. He stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by shadow, but his grin was unmistakable. "Why?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Why are you here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, as if studying me, before turning and walking away. The next day, I told my parents everything. My mother, visibly shaken, suggested we move. My father reluctantly agreed, and within a month, we left Belmont Street behind. To this day, I still think about Jacob and the shadow he cast over our lives. Some places hold onto their pasts too tightly, refusing to let go. Belmont Street was one of them. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.